You're listening to the Meditation and Attachment Podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome everybody. This is Meditation and Attachment, Deepening Your Practice. It's April 29th, 2021, 7:35 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And tonight, what I wanted to talk about was really what the end goal of practice is and what gets in the way of that, and then what do you do about that. You might say that the end goal of practice is so that you can see things clearly and respond to them and not cling or get trapped by attachment to anything. Dan Brown, one of my teachers, says that where you want to get to is a place where you can experience everything, but you experience it like riding on water. You take everything in, you're present for it, you see what's happening, you don't cling to anything. Everything arises and passes. You're completely present to the experience of that, and that there's no clinging. Then what we would need to look at is what gets in the way of being able to be in that place where that's what's happening. And we begin to talk about conditioning or conditioned responses to what happens, and then a kind of grabbiness or a stickiness that arises in all of these sense formations that pulls us out of the experiencing of the present moment in this endless flow of energy. Maybe looking at the way that we take that sensing experience and the creation of conceptual reality is a good place to start. We have our capacity to sense, depending on our capacities. We have that typical 5 senses. If you have all of those senses, touching, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and then you have mind. Mind often is a conditioned response that selects things that have a high value to us, so that it isn't a complete survey of what's happening, and it isn't a random survey of what's happening. It's a conditioned response to things that we prefer to experience, and that's where what our mind pays attention to. The untrained mind, of course, just does that without even noticing it. And then part of this undertaking, this training, would be to train yourself out of that, so that the mind doesn't just select things that you're conditioned to prefer over what's happening. I say what's happening because we don't necessarily create the perception of what's happening. We create the perception of what's meaningful to us, or what we prefer, and then leave out everything that we haven't been willing or had time to include in the way that we form things. So you have the object that can be sensed, the capacity to sense it. A consciousness of the sensing experience arises. It's evaluated for processing speed, needs urgent attention, doesn't really matter, pleasant if there's time. The science on this is pretty good, the brain science, in terms of timing. Urgent stuff is processed in 3/8 of a second. Almost everything doesn't matter, and so it's never processed. And then pleasant experience takes half a second to process. And pleasant experience needs to be twice the intensity and twice the duration of a stimulus in order to get the body-mind to react to it. So something that's urgent or negative, half the intensity, half the duration. Consciousness itself, the experience that we have of the present moment that we know through really a self-experience or through awareness, is a half a second behind what's actually happening, because it takes that long to generate the experience. So we all, in some sense, live in this illusion that we're experiencing what's happening now, when in fact we're experiencing what happened a half a second ago. In sports parlance, they call it playing in the zone. If you're not in the zone, you can't play. And the reason you can't play is that if you're playing tennis and you're consciously having to choose to swing at the ball, it already went by a half a second ago, so you can't hit it. But if you're just flowing in the experience of the game, then you can hit it, and then the experience of hitting it follows you actually having hit it. Is that making sense? One of the things about Western people in particular is the education that we have in terms of seeing and what seeing means. I know I tend to hit this pretty hard, but I'm fascinated by this process. The Pali word for it is tajpanati. Taja means constantly going back and evaluating, and panati means conceptual reality. So where we want to get to is this constantly moving back and forth between what we're sensing, the pure unfixated sensing experience, and then touch into what we've made out of it. It may also be that I'm just finishing a book on this subject, so it's in my mind. But we take in the sensing experience in these 5 sense gates and mind. So in traditional ways of describing that, I consciousness is the pure sensing experience, and I mind consciousness is what we make it into. So I consciousness sees light and form, and I mind consciousness, I'm looking at a chair with a stack of books on it. They're different, and so we want to be free to experience each of them. Because of this lag, most of the time, conceptual reality comes into consciousness fully formed. And so we have to kind of reverse engineer it. The other thing about it is that the body has the capacity for various kinds of perception in addition to just the pure sensing experience. When I was talking about this, the object that can be sensed, the capacity to sense when they meet contact arises, and then it's evaluated for processing speed. That's called Vedana in Pali. And Vedana can be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. I like to say urgent, doesn't matter, and pleasant. But the body has the capacity for all of those, whereas seeing, hearing, tasting, and smelling, it's pretty much always neutral in terms of Vedana. There's an additional consideration for Vedana, which is pressure. So when we say that we're experiencing unpleasant seeing experience, it's usually the pressure. Or when we're saying we experience unpleasant hearing, it's usually the pressure. So the noise is too loud, so it hurts the ears, but that's actually the aspect of pressure or loudness. The light is too bright and it hurts our eyes, but that's actually the brightness of the light, not the sensing of the light itself. Same with tasting and smelling. So the capacity to sense meets the object that can be sensed. A consciousness of the sensing experience arises. It's evaluated for Vedana or feeling tone or processing speed, and then it's compared to the perceptual database. Upanyada is the Pali word for that. And in that database are all of the entries of previously sensed things and what we made them into. In addition to that is the intention and the action that we took, and also the results of that action. All of that is in the database. When the undifferentiated sensing experience is compared to the database and the database attaches to it, what comes with that, of course, is the intention of how to respond to it, the outcome, the intention of how to respond to it, the action that we might take, and then as that unfolds, we record what happens. In the West, going back to Aristotle, who thought and taught that what's out there we see in a fairly neutral way and then create a working model of that internally. Epicurus was later, and he reasoned that it's not a direct translation of what's out there internally. If you have strong emotion, then that can affect it, change the way that you perceive it. And then with Plato, he reasoned that we have preferences for things, and so our preferences affect how we take in information, but that it's still coming from out there into us internally, and that we do have a tendency to take in everything that's out there and work with that kind of structure and understanding. This is very different than the Buddhist idea of taking in the raw sensing data, processing it internally, creating a perception of what's happening, and then projecting that outward. And then living in this experience of what's out there. So really, when we talk about meditation and coming into these places of deep insight and really understanding the nature of what's happening, we're talking about seeing how we take in the sensing experience, how we process it, what we make it into, and then project outward. If you can begin to investigate how you might affect that or distort that process, then you can begin to see the difference between what's actually there and what we make it into based on our preferences or conditioning. Do you like strawberries? How do you know that you like strawberries? If you like strawberries and you go into the supermarket and there's a giant mound of strawberries, how do you react to that? If you're indifferent to strawberries, is the reaction to that different? If you don't like strawberries, how do you react to that? The strawberry is the same in all of those cases, right? So it's not an inherent experience of strawberries. Of course, if you don't mentalize it very well, you might think that your experience of really loving strawberries is a universal experience, and that everybody really loves strawberries, but that actually is probably not the case. Those big Californians, I live in California, and we used to have berry season, but now berry season is all year, kind of like fire season. Giant, plump, glossy, delicious looking strawberries, but when you take a bite out of them, they're not, the taste is very subtle often. When we were in Myanmar, the strawberries were these little tiny things, and they were sort of oddly shaped for a strawberry. All the strawberries were slightly different in shape. There wasn't that uniformity, and they were not that brilliant red. But when you took a bite of them, this little tiny thing, the blast of strawberry flavor was really eye-opening and delicious. The problem, of course, when you're traveling and you haven't developed I like to call it the fauna and flora in your intestinal system that you need in order to be able to tolerate the bacteria that can come along with eating food and cause, extreme intestinal distress. After you've had a strawberry or two and then had an experience of intestinal distress that followed it, suddenly you have this other kind of relationship. You see the strawberry, it looks absolutely fantastic, and you have a sense of the flavor that it might be, but then of course the apprehension about whether the bacteria will get you or not. So you can see, as we are conditioned into these things, that it affects the response that we have in the way that we make the experience of these things happen for ourselves. And how much do you cling and hold on to and grip the experience? Do you prefer something so much that when they begin to pass away, you are bothered by that? Are you aversive to something so much that when they arise, you are bothered by that? Do you need to have a constant source of stimulus, a constant source of entertainment, so that if the level of stimulus falls away, that also bothers you? One of the things about living in a city like I do, and the constant back and forth and stimulus as much as you wanted, whenever you wanted, that when the pandemic hit, there was almost a kind of withdrawal from that intensity of stimulus that was confining, even though really all that was required is that you stay home and wait out the virus. There was a kind of discomfort that arose, and the disconnection from the stimulus of the world, not to mention the disconnection from the relationships, the emotional relationships that tend to fill a life if you can make those kinds of experiences work. There's a richness to that actual, the physicality of other human beings that you can be close to and comforted by, that in the pandemic, everybody becomes a source of danger if they're infected or not. And then now, of course, in Los Angeles, where we have managed as a city to really get the rate of infection low and made a huge effort to vaccinate people, that there's now this sense of opening. Our governor has said that June 15th, we're just going to open up because we have it enough in hand. I was talking to one of my students who's in Madrid, and he said that they're 5 months away from beginning the vaccination process. And so they don't have that sense at all of safety. And everything is in a hard lockdown, and they're actually going into a harder lockdown rather than apparently May 15th, they're going into a much harder lockdown. So part of this, of course, in terms of what we're talking about here, which is practice, is how can you come into this place where you're so embedded in the present moment, experiencing the arising and passing of sensing experience and the process of what you make all of that into. That you can be just in that immediate flow of arising and passing, that immediate flow of discernment and letting go without clinging to anything. And then paying attention to these areas that you get tight in or you get stuck in. So that's how to aim the practice in a way. I like to talk about it in terms of mentalizing. Sometimes these ideas that were developed in Western psychology, I think, are useful as a way to describe this. It's quite different than the poetry of early Buddhist writings, and it's quite different than the kind of monk speak. And I think one of the reasons why it's effective in communicating this is because we are largely conditioned to understand things in these terms because it's how our culture operates. And so, and also paying attention to what happens when you practice in certain ways. The way practice works is you do a particular investigation in a particular form of meditation, and then what comes from that particular kind of practice are insights that are associated to that kind of practice. And so with the big three lineages, the Theravada, the Zen, and the Vajrayana, or the Tibetan practices, the way that practice is organized and what techniques that you actually do produce these sort of predictable outcomes. We have our Theravada map, which we use, which is based on this four-path model of enlightenment, which is quite different than the the Vajrayana path. I study with Dan, who teaches in the Rime, which is one of the sublineages of the Bon tradition. And I like it because it's called the Pointing Out the Great Way tradition. I like a lot of instructions and a lot of explanation because that matches my learning style better. One of the reasons why Shinzen Young, the Vipassana teacher, Theravada teacher, was appealing because he gives a lot of instructions and things are quite clear. It's easier for me to follow. But when I first went to sit with Dan, I had not really sat with a Vajrayana teacher before, and I was really excited by the idea that there would be this perspective that was completely different than the Theravada perspective, and it would help me see things clear. And I came back from that retreat, and really for weeks afterwards, I was just disappointed by how similar they were. So we call that the many facets of the jewel, but we're really trying to see the same thing. One of the reasons I like Rime is because it's, Dan calls it the greatest hits of Tibetan Buddhism, where they select meditation strategies from all of the lineages based on which one they think is the most effective in illustrating the insight that they want you to have, so that you can move toward this place of really being able to inhabit the experience of the present moment and be in this flow of arising and passing and not clinging to anything. If you then begin to consider the obscurations or the things that cause you to be unable to see what that is, then focusing meditation techniques on that, so that you can open each of these insights up and then really take them in, and in seeing clearly change the way that you perceive things. One of the things that Vipassana meditation does really well is support mentalizing or metacognition. And so we have these dimensions. This really comes from the work of Peter Fonagy and Anthony Bateman. The spontaneous versus monitoring aspect of mentalizing. So you're sitting in meditation, of course, you're watching something happen. That's the monitoring aspect. The spontaneity aspect is that you just allow it to happen without interfering. This is an important thing to be able to do. You get swept too much on the spontaneous side, of course, you get caught up in the content and you lose the monitoring, you lose the meditation. But if you get swept over too hard onto the monitoring side, then you interfere with the spontaneous flow of experience. So we're going to focus mainly on this aspect of mentalizing tonight, allowing the body-mind to completely respond without inhibition, without interfering in it, and then at the same time being able to monitor the whole thing without losing the capacity to monitor. Another aspect of that mentalizing is self versus other. We talk a lot about the self experience in Buddhism, often in terms of a duality that it creates. The sense of self arises, and we take on this mantle of ownership, of doing, of controlling, of making. And then the experience of sensing separates, and we see the world as separate from the activity of the self, even though they're the same activity. That sensing the self is like sensing any other experience. But when we don't see that clearly, we have this sense that there's some intrinsic, solid, ongoing, separate activity, which is different from the sensing experience, so that the separate self can experience a separate sensing experience, even though it's the same experience when you see it clearly. And the Satipatthana Sutta, over and over again, it says the refrain, mindfulness of inside, mindfulness of outside, mindfulness of inside and outside. And what you begin to notice is that one sensing experience can trigger the activation of an additional sensing experience, and that there's this response of this constant, almost popcorn effect of sensing experiences going off, one after the other. And so we want to really see all of that sense of conditionality is one of the terms in Theravada Buddhism. The present moment sets up the possibility for the next moment. We choose, and the next moment unfolds and sets up the possibility for the next moment. You could use a quantum mechanics metaphor for this, that every possibility is open in front of you in this moment, but as soon as you pick one, what you picked is left and everything else falls away. But that opens into the next moment of all of the possibilities that are available to you based on your choice in the last one. But as soon as you pick something, everything except what you picked falls away, and you open into the next moment where all of the possibilities that were linked to the choice that you just made open up. But that may be a different set than 3 choices ago and what might have opened up there. So making this understanding of this is the self-experience and that's the world, and they're connected, internal and external. In Shinzen's way of describing practice, this becomes the focus in, focus out, investigation, the exterior space and the perception there, and then the internal, interior space. And then the last one is cognitive versus affective, so thinking versus emotion, auditory and visual experience versus the emotional experience. In Buddhist thought, of course, thought contains emotion. It's in the West that we've divided that and made reason preferable to emotion, even though evolutionarily the emotion probably came much earlier than reason came. And then also you notice in stressful situations, it isn't the emotional response that goes, it's the capacity to reason that goes. Stress has a sort of a reverse proportional response to your cognitive mind, your cognitive ability, your thinking. You go lower and lower into the brain, out of the mammalian brain, into the reptilian brain, into the worm brain. Just respond. So tonight what I thought we would do is track the experience of the present moment from the experience of thinking, using a simple technique and orienting ourselves just to one sense gate so it's easier to track that. If you've sat with me for a while, you'll know that what I'm describing is the meditation strategy of investigating self-generated emotion. So tracking a quiet mind, tracking one-off thoughts that just come and go, and tracking repeating thoughts or the thinking process. One of the things to notice about this is that the mind can be quiet because there's not a lot of stimulus going on, or it can be quiet because you're too rigid in your monitoring, so that you shut down the spontaneous aspect of experience. We want to be both freely spontaneous and at the same time monitoring it. So this class is called Meditation and Attachment. And so what you notice in different patterns of attachment experiences, different patterns in the mentalizing structure. People who are preoccupied in their attachment strategy tend to be very spontaneous, but they tend to lack monitoring. And what can happen when you do that is that your spontaneous reactivity can overrun other people's boundaries, other people's preferences, but because you're not monitoring it, you don't notice that that's what's happening. And it could cause disruption in relationships, and you don't even see that that's happening because you're not paying attention. If you tend to be dismissing in your attachment strategy, then it's the reverse. You tend to be rigid in your monitoring and control of what's happening, and that shuts down the spontaneity. In a sense, secure people operate with this back and forth, this easy, spontaneous and monitoring. If everything has to be filtered through monitoring, everything has to be filtered through a sense of self, so it becomes this rigid and controlling experience for other people, which can be quite off-putting. So what I want you to begin to do is be able to tell that these things are happening, that these mind states are arising. The Buddha described this, I think, very well in talking about it in these traditional mind states. Is the mind equanimous and therefore clear, and then what you're experiencing is an undistorted picture of what's actually happening? Or is the mind filled with lust or craving? He used the metaphor of a bowl, a mirror. 2,600 years ago, a mirror was a dark glazed bowl filled with water, and you saw reflected off the surface of that water a picture of the world. I think that this is an important metaphor. We don't experience things directly, we experience them as a reflection of mind. And depending on the condition of the mind, the image that comes off the surface of it can be accurate or quite distorted. And if you can't tell the difference between a mind that's equanimous and a mind that is inclined toward distortion, then the reflection off the surface of the mind becomes compelling and believable, and then we make our intention and take our action. But we take it from a distorted place, so the action is out of sync with what's actually happening, which can create these streams of negative karma. The mind is filled with lust. It's as if the water were dyed a bright color, so everything seems incredibly vivid, saturated. The mind is filled with anger. It's as if the water were boiling. Have you ever tried to see the reflection of the world through a pot of boiling water? It's very distorted. The mind is filled with sloth and torpor. It's as if algae had grown across it. If the mind is filled with restlessness and agitation, as if a breeze were blowing across it. The mind is filled with skeptical doubt. It's as if the water were muddied. And then I would say, if the mind is filled with preoccupation, how does it distort the perception of what's happening? If the mind is dismissing, how does that change things? If the mind is disorganized, how does that change the perception? And then what do you do to bring the mind back into balance so that you can actually see what's happening and be in this flow of arising and passing, knowing what's actually happening, but not clinging to anything like riding on water. Maybe you've had glimpses of that particular mind state. Lively awareness or awakened awareness might be a way of talking about it. You've had glimpses of it, or Shinzen will say, the taste of liberation. So then you also understand how ordinary that is. The metaphor that Dan uses, of course, is that the sun is shining and it shines on everything. But if clouds are in the way, if obscurations are in the way, you can't see the sun. Does it mean that the sun isn't there, or simply that the obscurations have clouded your ability to see it temporarily? And then we need to be able to recognize what those obscurations are and to have some agency in removing them. Maybe another way to put it would be that once you figure out what one of these mind states is, this lively, awakened awareness, how do you cause it to arise? And then how do you stabilize it so you're continuously experiencing? And then if you could do that, then what you could say about you is that you've stabilized awakened awareness so that you're enlightened, or you've stabilized the taste of liberation. You're enlightened, which is, coming back to the beginning of this talk, the goal of practice, or the end of practice, to get into this place. So I want you to begin to pay attention to this spontaneous versus monitoring or controlled capacity to mentalize, using this technique of evaluating thoughts. Is the mind quiet? Is the mind engaged in thinking a one-off thought that comes and goes? Or is the mind engaged in a perseverating thought that takes you out of the present moment into the past or the future? That's typically what repeating thoughts do. We worry about the future, and so the mind thinks over and over again about what might happen. The mind gets lost in the past, ruminating about something that might have happened. And in the beginning, it's simple. You just need to be able to tell those apart without getting pulled into the content of thought and losing the meditation. So we're going to anchor our attention in auditory thinking space and simply monitor whether the mind is quiet, whether it's engaged in one-off thought, or whether it's engaged in a repeating thought. Because we're householders and it's the end of the day for many of us, there's likely to be a sense of fatigue from that. We'll begin with a few minutes of breath counting from 1 to 10 back down to 1 on the out breath, only to gather the mind and then go into the experience of tracking thought in auditory space. Any questions about the technique before we begin? So go ahead and take your meditation posture. So any comments or questions about what we just did? Christian?
I had a pretty interesting sit. I think I was kind of in a hypnagogic state a little bit. You know, in the old Batman, how they'd get like a message from the Riddler, and then Batman would sort of read the message and then free associate like a string of words until he somehow solved the Riddler's riddle. I kind of had that where I got to
I sort of remember Adam West.
Yeah, that's the
on
one.
TV, but That's how long ago that was.
Yeah, it's kind of like just surfing through and clicking random Wikipedia links until you're in some weird conspiracy theory link or something.
Uh-huh.
And then, so that seemed very spontaneous. And then I caught myself somewhere, I think I was at, I wonder if there's something special in in baby blood that like corporations are gonna monetize. And then I realized how absurd it was, and then it became very controlled, and then I started thinking about how I was going to explain it, and so it kind of became meta, and then that seemed very controlled, and then I would get sort of lost in that chain of fantasy. So I'd kind of bounce back between the spontaneous and the controlled is how I understood it. So
Good. So you're just beginning to play with the controls.
I think so.
Good. Someone else? All right. Thank you all for coming and for your practice. We have a couple of slots left in the new level 2 that's starting in May. If that's something that's interesting you take a look at the website. We will have a retreat in June. It's a virtual retreat, also up on the website. In July, we're going to begin a series of level 1 a day long. So there'll be 4 of those in July and August. In September, we're going to start another level 2, and then in December we'll have our year-end retreat. I'm not sure whether it will be an actual retreat or a remote retreat. It'll depend on how the pandemic is going. So all of that stuff is on the website. That's what's coming up. I teach my beginners class on Tuesday and this class on Thursday. I offer the teaching freely, but I do hope that you'll support me and the work that Mettagroup is doing by making a donation. There's a link for that on the website and also in an email you might have gotten about the class. Thank you all for coming. I hope to see you soon on the path. Bye now.
Thanks, George. Yeah.